We just heard Starsky mention 493. People are throwing that number around. Why? What is it? What does it mean? And how is it different than Jim's piece that we saw where the state dissolved Normandy and is going to reorganize it?
493 was the 135-page student transfer bill that was passed by the legislature last week. Actually, it's got a lot more in it than just student transfers. Just to give you an idea, the original student transfer law that passed in 1993 was 2 paragraphs. This bill is 135 pages, so it's very extensive. It's got everything from student transfers to expansion of charter schools to make sure you let the parents know when a school's become unaccredited, to parent portals and online tutoring in libraries, all sorts of things. It's got a little bit for everybody to like, and sometimes a little bit for everybody not to like. How
did it get from 2 paragraphs to 135 pages?
Well, that's what happens when things are addressed by the legislature. You know, it started as the legislature attempting to make some changes to the school transfer statute. Basically trying to, what happened in effect was the legislature came in and said, you know, we want to reduce the number of kids who are eligible to transfer. And we also want to reduce the financial burden on the unaccredited school districts, because as we've seen play out this school year, it's been incredibly expensive on Normandy and Riverview, and we're looking at Normandy potentially being insolvent in the next few weeks and Riverview being insolvent next year. So that was the attempt, and as things play out, you have lawmakers who want certain aspects in the bill and who won't vote for it unless it gets something else in there, and so then we end up with a pretty large piece of legislation.
Maybe we should tick through just a few things here. I think we can represent this visually to some degree. Senate Bill 439, here are the highlights. 493. Tuition limits. Can you kind of explain what that means? What are we talking about tuition here?
Depending on how much a receiving district charges, the sending district might have to pay only 90%, and the state would pick up the other 10%. It might only have to pay 70%, and if it's, depending on whether it's 90 or 70, there might be incentives involved. There might be, I think one of the incentives is that the test scores for some of the transfer students wouldn't be counted in the receiving district's test scores.
If they pick up more of the cost.
Right, for 3 years or 5 years.
And when we say tuition, individual schools, people may not realize this, charge different amounts for what it costs to educate a child.
For transfer students, and it could be anywhere from, I think Clayton's is the highest, around 20,000, and it goes down to, I think, around 7,000 or 8,000 per student.
Which is often a lot more than what the sending district receives from the state per student.
Yes.
Right, and that's why Normandy is in the financial shape it's in.
No transportation requirement. Transportation was something that was a little undefined, and they said certain districts we will pay to send our students to certain districts, so that this 493 does what with transportation?
It makes it optional. So the sending districts can decide whether or not they want to send buses at all. So the existing
bill... Which
means
they will not, I would assume.
You would assume so. But they could decide to, potentially.
Because that's been a cost as well, and it's been pretty
burdensome. Not as much as tuition, but still a cost.
Right. And that makes transferring much more difficult for a lot of children, because not every parent can, not every parent has transportation in either of those 2 districts, and also not every parent has a work schedule that allows them to take their kids to and from school every day.
Especially if it's as far away as some of the districts that we're actually being transferred to. Private school option, what is this? And also just in the Kansas City, St. Louis area.
This is what has caused a lot of controversy, a lot of conversation, and has prompted Governor Nixon to be very unhappy. Private school option means that if it's approved by voters in one of the unaccredited districts, that students could transfer to a non-sectarian private school in that district, and the money that would pay the tuition would come only from their locally generated tax funds, not from the state. And this is something that people sometimes use a shorter hand and say this is vouchers. And other people say, no, it's not a voucher. A voucher bill would be much broader than this. It would be much more choice. So, but this is what has said made people say that Governor Nixon may end up vetoing the bill altogether.
Is there a private non-sectarian school in the Normandy School District?
No. And so that's what's fascinating about this. This one single piece in this bill has been the most hotly contested part of it, but it doesn't really apply to the current situation. So kids in Normandy have no options besides transferring out to public schools. And from what I understand, there might be one small
Yeah, there's one in
private
Riverview
school
Gardens.
in Riverview Gardens.
I believe it's called Storman Academy or something like that.
Yeah.
But
So why is this such a priority for a particular group?
it's a very good question, and I think the underlying principle here has always been we want to give students more options for quality education, and they're saying this should be another option. Now, these private schools wouldn't necessarily want to take students because one of the things private schools pride themselves on is that there are no government strings attached because they don't take any government money. If they accept transfer students, they have to be accredited by whatever group accredits private schools in their sphere. They have to make sure that the students take MAP tests and other things. And if their enrollment rises, I believe it's 25%, then they have even more strictures put on them. So I've talked to headmasters at private schools and asked them about this question, not on this bill, but just a question in general about getting public money. And a lot of them will reflexively say, no, we don't want public scrutiny, we don't want public restrictions, so we don't want public money.
Okay, the next thing on our graphic, it says lapsing districts, and giving the state the ability to intervene. What is that talking about in terms of 493?
That's basically what
We've seen this week.
What the state
Right.
did to Normandy this week, although they didn't do it under 493 because that's not law. They did it under another bill that was passed last year called 125, which basically gave the state board and the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education greater latitude, more choices to what they could do for districts that are chronically
And the charter
underperforming.
schools is not too dissimilar from the private school option in terms of the spirit of more options is the goal.
Well, the charter school provision in the Senate bill that is now before the governor, it basically makes it easier to open up a charter school in Riverview or Normandy. So by allowing, I think it shortens the amount of time. I mean, it just allows them to expedite. I think more groups could open a charter school under this legislation.
We have to talk about it because we've teased it by seeing it here, but because then I want to get to a piece that you wrote recently, Elisa. But the school improvement fund, what would this be and where does this money come from? What would it be used for?
The school improvement fund in general, it will be used to help raise student achievement whenever districts are not performing up to par, and it's just one of many funds that were created by the bill. Where the money's going to come from, I guess it'll have to be appropriated from the general fund. I just do want to make one point on the charter schools to reemphasize that charter schools are public schools. They're not part of school districts, but they're public schools already. They're being paid for by the public, so it's a little different than the non-sectarian private school.
Let's tackle that in a little bit later in the show because I want to talk about the intersection of poverty and performance in schools. You did a long piece, a very thorough, in-depth piece in the paper recently. Where do these intersect, and is that part of the conversation in an adequate way, do you think?
Well, so the piece took a look at not only the concentrations of poverty in the Normandy and Riverview Gardens school districts, but also we took a look at how students were performing in school districts across the region, even in high-performing districts. And what we found is there's, we weren't really, in some ways we weren't telling people anything that was new. We were showing that low-income students have a tremendous disadvantage when it comes to school performance. And so in Normandy and Riverview Gardens, you have, those two districts are comprised primarily of students who are of very little means.
And this impacts their education how? What does the data show?
So, with poverty, the thing that we don't see, the one thing that the data does not show is how much. We can't show causation, so we don't know what exactly causes low school performance. We don't know. I mean, we do know that with poverty, oftentimes comes high mobility. Kids move around a lot. That affects their performance. We know that. We look at occupancy rates in Riverview Gardens. We see there's a high number of rentals. Kids coming from impoverished homes a lot of times have stresses in their lives that make it difficult to do their homework at night. So what the data also shows is that even in school districts like Ladue, even in high-performing districts like Kirkwood and Parkway, we see that kids coming from low-income backgrounds aren't doing nearly as well as their more affluent peers.